My name is Carol Mack. I'm the Chief Executive of ACF. Our mission is to support foundations to be ambitious and effective in the way that they use their resources for social good. I'm sure you are all aware that COVID-19 and the lockdown have had a disproportionate impact on Black and minority ethnic communities. Quite simply, it has laid bare the systemic racism and discrimination in our society for all to see. ACF is committed to playing its role in supporting a more diverse, equitable and inclusive foundation sector. And to achieve this, we need to recognise and tackle racism in all its forms. It's therefore very heartening that so many of you have joined this morning to discuss this important and urgent topic. Only our annual conference has been attended by more people from the foundation community in the last 12 months. So thank you for joining in and agreeing that this is a topic that it is time for the foundation community to consider. I'd like to thank our expert panelists for being here. I'm very much looking forward to hearing their take on the response by foundations to racial disparities in the light of COVID-19 and what they would like to see happen next. I'd especially like to thank Fozia Irvin, trustee of ACF and chief executive of the Luton and Bedfordshire Community Foundation, for chairing this session. And I'm going to hand over to Fozia in just a moment. I have to do some housekeeping first. I don't need to tell you where the fire exit is. Hopefully you know where your own fire exit is. But I do need to tell you that the meeting is being recorded and it will be made publicly available afterwards. We're going to finish on time at 12:15. We know that many of you will have busy Zoom-filled days and you don't want a meeting to run on longer than planned, even though I'm sure the discussion could fill much more time than that. So we will finish at 12:15. We're going to hear from each of our panelists, and there will be space for questions after that, but pop them in the Q&A box as we go along. We're going to moderate the questions because we anticipate more questions than we will have time. So we'll try and group them together and respond to as many as we can. If you have technical issues, again, either in the chat box or in the Q&A space, and ACF staff will try to help with those. But for now, that's enough from me. I'd like to hand over to Fozia. Thank you so much, Fozia.
Thanks, Carol. Hi everyone, my name is Fozia, and as Carol mentioned, I'm a trustee at ACF. My day job is as CEO at Bedfordshire and Luton Community Foundation, which is a place-based funder. I also am part of the steering group for the Funders Alliance for Race Equality, which is a group of funders focusing on this specific issue. And I lead the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Coalition, which is a group of 17 foundations who've made a commitment to change practice within their funding. So that's a bit about my background. I'm really pleased to be having this conversation. And I just want to really start by taking a moment to reflect on the timing of this event. You know, we're all very aware that there's been a bright light shone on the reality of racism, both individual and institutionalized. The circumstances that we're in with the killing of George Floyd, the report on the disproportionate impact of COVID on BAME communities, the global demonstrations in support of Black Lives Matter, and important questions about slavery and colonialism. All of these factors, all of these circumstances are leading us to a moment where I really think the foundation sector needs to pause and to reflect and think about our role within our greater circumstances. We know, for example, that in relation to BAME-led charities, even though they are at the coalface of dealing with this crisis, they are underfunded, the infrastructure is weak, and the demands being placed on them are greater than ever. We have organisations such as Charity So White, and Fatima will be talking about this later, who are questioning whether philanthropy and foundations are doing enough and whether or not the speed of our response has been adequate or not in addressing all of these issues. We have some signs of change. We have initiatives like the Funders Alliance for Race Equality, and in particular the funding audit tool, which has been developed by Barrow Cadbury and Lloyds Bank Foundation, and which is starting to be used. And that audit tool allows us for the first time to have standardized definitions and to be able to monitor or set a baseline for our funding distribution. So there are initiatives like that. There are initiatives like the DEI Coalition, although I recognise that the DEI Coalition is fundamentally about equitable grant making and anti-racism work, which is a key part of this, is a separate strand. It's something which has to be addressed and tackled systemically and in a very different way. There are some signs that things are changing, but we also have evidence and facts, such as the fact that 99% of trustees of foundations are white, which in this day and age is a shocking statistic. And if we as foundations claim to be working for the public benefit, hence having a charitable status, we really need to question whether or not we represent and reflect the communities that we serve. So hopefully today we'll have a chance to pick the brains of some experts who are all working in this area and have a discussion with all of you to see where we go from here. What does philanthropy need to do in order to be part of the solution and not part of the problem? So what we're actually going to start off with is we're just going to try and get a sense of where foundations are. And so I'm just going to ask Max to talk about a quick poll that we want to run just in the next few minutes whilst everybody's online.
Thank you very much, Fozia. So I'm just going to bring up the poll. There are 175 attendees at the moment, so this should give us quite a nice sample. So we're asking 1 questions with 4 elements to it. Feel free to start voting when you are able to. So to what extent do you think your foundation considers race in its strategy, in its funding programs, in its recruitment of trustees, and in its recruitment of staff? And in this instance, 1 means not at all, and 5 is in all cases or to a full extent. I'll just give you a few more moments to complete this, and then we will share the results. And I will read out the results for the benefit of the recording, because the recording doesn't show the poll in the same way. Two-thirds of you have voted now, so we'll end it shortly. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now and share the results with you on the screen. I think what we can see is that this is anonymous, so we won't identify which foundations, but there are about 10% of people feeling that their foundation doesn't consider race at all in its strategy. Majority to some extent, and a few more towards the higher end. Similar sort of spread also for funding programs, primarily around grant making, but also other kinds of funding, would probably include social investment for some. Perhaps less positive in terms of recruitment of trustees. So we have nearly half of attendees saying that their foundation does not consider race in recruitment at all, or very little, with only 10% saying to a full extent. Slightly more positive, but not particularly positive in terms of recruitment of staff. So again, the balance is very much in terms of not considering race in recruitment of staff and trustees. So I'll stop sharing those results and pass back to Fozia.
Thank you, Max. I think that poll really summarises a lot of the conversations that I've been having with people within the sector. I think there's a lot of awareness and interest, but perhaps the lack of clarity about what the practical measures are that we should be implementing. It seems that people know that this is an important area, they know it's critical to us being effective grant makers, but they're not quite sure about how to navigate this space. And hopefully our 4 panelists will help them do exactly that. So without further ado, I'll go straight into introducing our first panelist, and then I'll invite her to speak. Dilhani Vijay Sikera is the head of head of influence at Comic Relief, and she's been working on part of their strategy for social change. She's over 15 years of global experience in human rights and development, and she's lived and worked in East Africa for a long time, and worked with organisations such as Amnesty International and Restless Development. And she's going to talk to us about the approach of Comic Relief. Thank you, Dilhani.
Thank you so much, Fawzia, and hi to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here on such an important issue. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Comic Relief has begun to consider and approach the issue of sort of racial equality in funding within its work and as part of its wider work around diversity and inclusion. And I guess I want to say up front, we're very early in our journey around this work. We're learning all the time. We're not perfect, and we're certainly not getting everything right. But I think for us, we decided to take action quite early on as evidence was emerging through the COVID crisis. We were really informed by the work that was being done by Ubele, the Runnymede Trust, and also Charities So White, who were commentating on the issues emerging. And I kind of wanted to read something from the Ubele report, because I think it's what they have found is so critical and important. So 87% of organisations led by Black and ethnic minority groups receive less than 10,000 and 100,000 per annum, and largely depend on volunteers. Most of those organisations, 68%, do not have reserves. Only 19% have reserves of more than 3 months. And so there's a very specific set of challenges that we as a sector need to deal with, both in terms of being able to invest in lived experience organisations and ensuring that we're supporting them to be effective and sustainable, not just during this crisis, but beyond the crisis as well. So that was, I guess, our major starting point in terms of the evidence that we were centering on. We were also hearing a lot from our staff who were diverse as well, who were talking about these issues and feeling very concerned about whether enough was being done within the sector to address them. So how did we sort of move forward? So we acted quite practically and simply. So we reached out to lived experience organisations and experts and Charities So White quite early on in May to start understanding what these issues were and think about the role that we should be playing as a funder. We centred the work in this space within the leadership in our organisation who were coming from those communities. So myself and several other colleagues who, felt that we had experience and expertise linked to these communities have provided quite a lot of insight into the strategy as it moves forward. And I think that has been really important as well. We presented very early on practical steps to the leadership team in order to kind of approve changes in action, and we've basically set up tailored and adapted funding going forward within this crisis, and I hope beyond that we will look at how that informs our wider funding programs in the future. So there are 2 kind of main areas of action that we've taken. So one is a proactive funding program for intermediary organisations from the community, so those who can onward grant to smaller frontline organisations in the UK, recognising A, we're a kind of medium-sized funder, and B, we want to kind of place that funding within kind of lived experience institutions that have better grassroots reach than we potentially have. That programme just recently closed, and we're just going through the decision making around that. We have a panel meeting today to approve those recommended grants, but we had over 88 applicants for that programme. I guess some of the reflections we've had as a team, there was, as expected, quite a wide range of capacity and scale of funding within those institutions. We've decided we will put some additional funding in place in order to cater to capacity building and core costs, because there was more provision that is needed there. Some of those organisations are really small, so there is definitely space for grassroots small scale funding to be expanded within the ecosystem of funding that's available in the UK. So I think that's really important as well. The second action that we're taking sort of from a funding perspective, so we've got a Change Makers programme that is coming out very soon, hopefully this week, which will invest in user-led organisations in the UK, 20% of which will be ring-fenced to organisations from Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. So that's the first time we're also using ring-fencing in our funding as an organisation, and I guess there's a couple of reasons why we've done that. So one, we felt absolutely straight off the bat, if we didn't deliver a tailored programme, we weren't going to get applications through the door. And so I think that will be an interesting area to sort of reflect on and discuss how we address that, because of the level of exclusion and challenges faced. We also wanted to signal, I guess, the importance of this issue at this time. And so ring fencing is something we're testing, and I hope will provide a significant amount of learning, but will also help organisations to access those funds in a way that they might have struggled with in wider programmes where we know there are challenges around bias and discrimination through many funding processes, and I'm sure Debbie will speak more to that. The third kind of step that we're taking as an organisation is beginning to sort of really review our application and data journey as an organisation, and we're sort of doing that with support from the DEI coalition and also from the work that Debbie is doing as well. So those are some of the things that we're doing. I know I'm running out of time. I just wanted to focus quite practically on the work that we have done so far. I guess there's three questions that emerge from me, for me. One is around trust. I feel that we have done an okay job in not waiting for perfect evidence and information in order to take action. I think we could have maybe acted more quickly and more swiftly, but I do see in the kind of sector conversations I'm part of and the policy discussions that are happening that this issue of traditional evidence as a basis for action is holding us back. So who is it we're going to trust? And when is it sufficient that we focus on the experience and insight that we're gaining from organisations and not waiting until the official national statistics emerge? The second is around agility. We've had to do a lot of adapting and changing of how we work because we have these very specific governance set up that is not set up for crises and not necessarily set up for working in specific situations of need. So we've made several adaptations, and I would kind of suggest that's going to be quite important for the sector more widely. The third one that feels the most important for me is that this is just one moment in many that we've had in the past and many that will happen in the future. So how do we use this lens that we've talked about to really focus on changing practices within charity, philanthropy and funder practice, because actually it's just not good enough that we're still at a situation where organisations are being kind of rejected out of hand because their applications aren't worded in the correct way. They don't know that funding from institutions like Comic Relief is accessible to all kinds of organisations, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into all of that now because I'm sure others will, but I hope that has been really useful, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Villani. I mean, we could spend another half an hour just talking about various points that you've raised. I was really interested in the point you raised about universal pots of funding and whether or not they reach people equally. That's something that's at the core of the DEI coalition. So I'm glad that Comic Relief is recognising and working with that. Moving swiftly on to Debbie. Debbie Pippard is our speaker from the Funders for Race Equality, and she's Director of Programmes at Barrow Cadbury Trust. She has overall responsibility for delivery of the Trust's migration, criminal justice and economic justice programmes, and she's also chair of the board of the Foundry in Vauxhall and of Global Dialogue. And she has also worked for the Big Lottery Fund and run a charity and worked in the NHS. But primarily, Debbie's here to talk about her role with the Funders Alliance. Thank you, Debbie. Debbie, we can't hear you.
Is that better?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Yeah, good. Sorry about that. I've got headphone trouble. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here and to be talking to so many people. It's really so wonderful, having been working in this area for a while, to have reached a moment when there's so much interest in this subject and clearly so much appetite for change. I work for Barrow Cadbury Trust. We've got a long-standing interest in racial justice and racial equity. And I'm one of the founder members of the Funders for Racial Equality Alliance. And that was started by a group of foundations, really with some frustration about the slow pace of change. In a way, we sometimes, there's a number of foundations that have been working on this area for a little while, but we felt that there was a role for a learning community to come together to encourage change, discuss things that we've been doing, and stimulate other foundations to get interested in racial equity and change their practices as well. So we started a few years ago now, and started off really by just being an information exchange forum. We then got a slot at ACF National Conference a couple of years ago, and were really encouraged by about 40 people coming to that, all very enthusiastic and wanting to make changes in their own foundation. And we've really grown since then. So we now have 32 foundations actively engaged in the network, and we've had contact with, I would estimate, about 50 to 60 individuals from those foundations. And our experience of funder collaboration is really that you need capacity to grow beyond that information exchange. So a critical point came for us when we got funding together from within the membership to get ourselves a secretariat. And in the spirit of equity, we committed very early on to also fund at an equal level a network of the main race equality organisations. So we're funding the core network as well, and that commitment to equity has kind of gone throughout our work. So we have three main aims. The first is increasing the understanding of and focus on race equality funding in foundations. The second is more and better funding to address race equality issues. And the third is to increase representation in foundation leadership and governance. And we think if you influence all of those three levers, you will achieve more funding for both for the race equality sector and more funding on race equality issues. Those two things aren't quite the same, as everybody here will know. So we do this by convening our funders to identify common ground to share good practice and also opportunity to collaborate, both among ourselves and also with the sector. And we were really pleased to have a session where BAME-led shared their findings from their survey. I think that had a big impact on a lot of foundations, and really quite a shock to some foundations that weren't quite as aware of the issues that were going on. We also we want to identify new ways to talk about and act on race equality. We facilitate the exchange of knowledge, tools and solutions between foundations. We've had some very interesting sharing of information between foundations. And we also want to support the development of BAME voices, representation and inclusion in the foundation sector. We're thinking about how to do that at the moment. And on a kind of personal basis, we've undertaken to live our values in practice as much as we can. I think that we've started to challenge each other about that. That network has become, I think, a space which I hope is safe for people to raise things. I've certainly noticed some different things being raised recently, and also a place at which we can challenge ourselves. And we also, of course, want to work collaboratively with the sector. We've got 3 projects on the go currently. The one which is at the most advanced stage is the audit that Fozia mentioned at the start. So this is intended to be a straightforward tool that all foundations can use to audit the amount of their grant making which is going to the race equality sector, the amount that's going on race equality issues, the type of funding you're making, and whether you're addressing race equality issues at a structural level or you're addressing the symptoms. Both are very important to do. So we developed, tested and piloted that. And I think that it's turned out to be just in time for this huge focus on race equality. We know that 50 foundations have already done that audit, for those numbers greatly boosted by the community foundations doing it en masse, and we've got at least a dozen others who are planning to do it. We'll collate those findings. We've undertaken to collate the findings from the Alliance member and use that as a baseline for progress. But we also want to encourage people who are not in the Alliance to submit their answers as well. We'll collate them and share them on an anonymous basis. And there's information available and guidance for anybody who wants to do that audit. We've already had a question about posting a link to it. I will circulate the link to all the materials, and help is available if you want on a one-to-one basis. The second project we're doing is a mapping of the sector, and that's being led by Joseph Rowntree Community Foundation and who else? Esme Fairbairn, I think. Sorry, I forgot the other foundations are on that. And we're aiming to map organisations in England and Wales that meet our criterion of being of the sector. And that's a straightforward definition agreed with the sector. It's just a simple majority of being led by people from minority ethnic communities at the trustee level and at the senior staff level. That map is going to cover all sectors and all types of activity, and we aim to get an overall picture of the sector, who's doing what, where they're based, the kind of organisations they are, and the size. That mapping tender is out for advert at the moment. If anybody knows anybody who might want to do that, that's still available until the end of the week. And that's going to be the biggest exercise in mapping the sector since Voice for Change England did theirs in 2007, and at that time they said we need urgent action. I think this time we want to do urgent action. You know, the time is now if we're ever going to do it. And then our third priority was supporting increased representation, and we're discussing that at the moment in the Alliance. We've got some ideas and can't share them at the moment because they're at an early stage of development, but we're hoping to do something about that, and I've been really pleased to see some of the sort of solidarity groupings build up from people who are working in the sector at the moment. So that's where we're at the moment. We're an alliance of all kinds of organisations, all kinds of foundations at all different stages of their development of this. We are facing increasing internal and external pressure for change, and we really we have seen this such a burst of activity around this. It's far overdue, both from a point of view of social equity, social justice, but also thinking about where a lot of the money frankly came from in the foundation sector. It's not, we really can't allow this moment to pass. So if you want to know more about the Alliance, I can tell you more. We can share all the information about the audit and look forward to having more of you join us soon.
Thank you, Debbie. And I think the work that the Alliance is doing is really important. And if this is an area of work that your foundation is interested in, then joining the Alliance is really a good way to get started, because you'll become part of a learning community where you're sharing resources, where you've got support, where you've got other people to discuss ideas with, discuss problems with. So once we've shared that link, I would really urge you to join. Moving on to our third speaker, Derek Bardwell, who I'm sure all of you know in any case, but he's a writer, a philanthropy advisor, and former director of programs at the Stephen Lawrence Trust. He's also a journalist and contributed to The Times, Time Out, and BBC World Service. He directed funding portfolios for Esme Fairbairn and the National Lottery, and he's also a founding member of Future Foundations and a trustee of 30 Percy Foundation. He also hosts the podcast Just Cause, which I would highly recommend, and not because I'm on it. And his first book, No Win Race, was a Sunday Times and Financial Times Book of the Year shortlist for 2019. Derek, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Ozia, and thanks for having me here today. I guess my first reflection was a WhatsApp message that came from a colleague of mine last Friday, where she said that her anger had turned to heartbreak with regard to the behaviours of Trust and Foundation with regard to race. And I guess reflecting back 3 months ago when Future Foundations UK put in the first statement about what foundations could do to improve the situation, there was one line that I had, which was incredibly insensitive, and I realized this, but one of the things that we kind of omitted from the statement was where I felt as if the way that the philanthropic and funding sector was acting was almost as if they were turning Black people away from the hospital while they were under duress. And that was insensitive, and it was right that we didn't put that down. But they're 3 months on, and looking at the lack of action that's occurred in the last 3 months, really occurs to me that it still feels that way. It still feels as if philanthropy has turned its back on Black people. It's back on Black people, and it feels as if at a time when the pain, and when I say the pain, anyone that's a person of color that knows this at this particular point, the pain is really high for us now, and our expectations are low, and it shouldn't be that way. So I'm just going to point out a few facts that are very apparent and have come to light even more so in the last few months. One, we as people of color experience British society completely differently to the way that most of the people that govern and run foundations experience life in Britain. It's clear that there is a lack of understanding on how people of color experience life in Britain. And there is a disconnect between the actions of foundations to work with and for people of color on these issues because of that lack of understanding. Two, we're still in a situation where Black people are having to ask white people for money. That is the same dynamic, which means that the level of honesty is not going to be there. It means that the power dynamics is going to be weighted in one way. And it also means that the levels of trust is also very difficult because it feels as if we're not trusted. Three, the focus of this attention is always on our pain. And it's never on our abundance. It's never on our innovation. It shouldn't take an incident like George Floyd. It shouldn't take statistics like the COVID statistics for people to have action around issues of race, given it underpins everything that foundations, funders, in fact, all institutions should be doing. And I point to the fact that for the last 3 years, we have had reports about lack of diversity. We've had tons of reports, and this doesn't just go back to the last 3 months. This goes back to the last 3 years. It goes back to the last 30 years. It goes back to the last 300 years, and still there is a high level of inertia. We're going through unprecedented times at the moment, and that calls for unprecedented responses. Are we sure that funders have started to do anything fundamentally different to be able to respond to this issue? 5, I think as FFUK, Charity So White, Ubele, and various other people, we have all tried various and different tactics to try and get the funding sector to move. We've sat down on endless consultations. We've been polite, we've been antagonistic, we've provided practical solutions, we've supplied endless lists, we've endured painful conversations. And, you know, quite frankly, if I'm being honest, it's probably been one of the most undignified for myself personally times that I've had in my professional career, in terms of having some of these conversations, hearing what's come back, and actually felt that no one has listened, but felt like the job has been done because they've had a conversation with me. 6, evidence, data, and learning has largely been ignored, which makes it a fallacy that the funding sector would say that this is of importance. The inertia is a conscious act. We've gone through Brexit, Grenfell, Windrush, George Floyd, COVID-19. It's been a relentless onslaught over the last 4 years. And this is not even talking about this systemically or historically. So it's a conscious act. And as I said, race underpins everything. And when I say that, I say that when we look at disparities when it comes to race, and when that intersects with other issues and other identities, then the racial disparities are incredibly stark. We know that from the race disparity audit from a few years ago, from 2017. We know it anecdotally, we know it statistically. This isn't a thing that is strictly about COVID or George Floyd or policing. This actually runs through the lifeblood of how and what we do. So I come back to an incident that happened to me a few years ago, where I was in a meeting with an older white male, 2 older white males, and I turned them down for funding. And they didn't take too kindly to me saying it. So as I was saying, no, you're not going to get funding, they responded with, do you realize that Black people were happier when they were in subservient positions? That was their response. And I remember at that particular time not knowing who I would be able to speak to within my institution to be able to complain about that incident, or how to respond to that incident, or whether anyone that was ahead of me in power would be able to respond to that. And the thing that strikes me is that every day, as a person of color and people of color, they are hearing these things that are doing harm. They are seeing organizations and funders who are funding organizations who will admit that they're not diverse in terms of their leadership, they're not diverse in terms of their governance, and struggle to fund race. And they can acknowledge it themselves, yet continue to fund organizations that have similar demographics on their governance, expecting them to be any better than they are at dealing with race than they are. So I'm saying that what you're seeing is an issue of not just lack of investment into Black and brown organizations, you're also talking about investments into organizations that are doing harm and are exacerbating some of these issues as well. So this is where I say that it runs through the lifeblood of everything that funders should be doing. So for me, in terms of solutions, I look at reconciliation around a lot of these issues. there has to be an admission and an acknowledgement of the systemic failures around funding and going through a deep dive. I'm not talking about a 5 or 10 day consultancy, but a really deep dive in how institutions do this and do this well. And that's not just governance, it's not just diversification, it's a real deep dive into it. I'm an advocate for reparative grant making, which looks to invest, not only divest in extractive investments that fundamentally do more damage than any of your money that you're giving away can do to do good, but also around either building an endowment for Black and Brown communities, a commission that fundamentally aims to tackle this as a philanthropic sector as a whole, a regrowth of infrastructure and looking at this on a long-term basis, or at the very least, putting money into alternative provision for organizations like Resourcing Racial Justice, who are able to be Black and Brown governed, where all of the decisions are made by Black and Brown people, to be able to invest that money in a way that is fully understandable. And I come back to it, when you look at the sector is rich. Charity So White, Ubele, Resourcing Racial Justice, Kwanda, Black Lives Matter, Racial Justice Network, Land in Our Names, Healing Justice London, Made Up Kitchen, Glitch, Stopwatch, Black Thrive, D Woods, Amara Spence, Centre for Knowledge Equity. There are plenty of organizations that are out there that can be invested in, that can do this work and take it forward. And I come back to one final thing. We've just seen Black Lives Matter have raised from the public. They've just reached £1 million from public giving. And often the funding sector will turn around and say, we don't like to go against public will. We don't want to go against public will. But now you're actually actively ignoring public will, because even the general public are investing a lot of money into Black causes and Black-led causes. I wonder whether any foundation has ever invested up to £1 million into a Black-led cause as a single foundation. And as a final point, I say, the civil rights movement, which we all know about, but Black people are the canaries in the mine. When stuff happens that's bad, it tends to happen to Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities first. The civil rights movement didn't just benefit Black people, it benefited everyone. Their success liberated everyone. And I always say that our liberation and our dignity are tied together. So this is a time to heed the canaries. And when I say heed the canaries, I don't mean just heeding the canaries in our pain, but heeding the canaries in our abundance too.
Thank you, Derek. That was an amazing, powerful, compelling, and at times painful voice to listen to, but so urgent, so critical. And I really thank you for your honesty, because I know that you're speaking on behalf of a lot of brown and Black people who work in foundations and who are not in a position to talk in such an open way and such a powerful way. So thank you. I want to now move on to Fatima Iftikhar, who's from Charity So White. Fatima has been involved with building innovative campaigns like the Charity So White for a number of years. She's a campaigner and activist on issues of race and structural inequality. She's also a non-executive director of Doing Social and an Aziz Foundation scholar, currently studying a master's in social policy. Fatima, I'll hand over to you.
Funders, we have money for BAME organisations. Please apply. Me, I don't have time or capacity to do this. Funders, you don't need to put much detail. Please just put through an application. Me, fine. Funders, unfortunately, this is not quite what we're looking to fund. Hashtag Charity So White. When a white-led organisation is appointed as an intermediary for race equality funding, it shows you how deep the distrust of Black and Brown-led organisations runs. Hashtag Charity So White. When a funder advertises a job saying they're looking for someone with lived experiences of migration, but still end up hiring someone who doesn't, Foundations can't say that they don't have credible candidates to lead these initiatives. They need to change their mindset of who is credible with our communities and can truly enable people at the margins to build power. #CharitySoWhite. White people with power in big organizations talk about diversity without thinking about the work that is needed, the space that they need to give up, the relationships they have a responsibility to build, and the resources that they need to share. They take without giving. #CharitySoWhite. These are just a number of stories and experiences that we've been inundated with over the last year, and particularly over the last months as a campaign. BAME-led organisations have been in crisis far before COVID-19. They are chronically underfunded by a structurally racist funding sector. And since the start of this pandemic, before the media attention or the government inquiries, there have been numerous organisations in civil society and individuals ringing the alarm on the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on BAME communities and BAME-led organisations and charities. At CharitySoWhite, we laid out very clearly at the start of this crisis our deep concern of how it would deepen racial inequalities. We laid out clear principles and actions for charities and funders to be taking, raising our concern that racial injustice in their response was inevitable if they kept functioning under the policies and processes that they were built on that have led to this underfunding of BAME VCS organisations. As you can tell, these have not been heeded. Funders have continued to choose not to act. And in early April, Ubele Initiative published this resource that is research that has been mentioned a couple of times, that 9 out of 10 BAME VCS organisations face closure in 3 months' time. We are now closing in on 3 months. And the organisations in question facing closure provide vital community-led support and services. And this is all happening whilst foundations continue to sit on £60 billion worth of assets. At the same time as this inaction on these calls, we've seen many funders move faster than ever, and rightly so, to support existing grantees, adapting policies and practices that were previously claimed impossible to change. In the foundation sector, inaction on racial justice is an active choice to distance from power. And if the sector, I believe that if the sector does not change the way it works, it is coming up to face a moment of reckoning. We've seen the last few months so many excuses from organisations like the National Emergencies Trust of how stretched they are as a reason for why they haven't taken meaningful action. If you're stretched, how stretched are the organisations on the front line responding to the crisis? There's also a pretense of being frozen by fear of doing the wrong thing. The wrong thing is already happening, and it might be time to further question if you're truly afraid of doing the right thing and what that means for your own positions and for your organisations. As Derek has said, this moment is not about more calls for evidence on why to act. ACF has long told the sector that it is 99% white and something needs to be done about it. But this isn't just about an issue of representation. Over the last few weeks, we've seen questions not just raised about how assets are hoarded, but a growing outcry on how these assets have come to be accumulated and on the back of which injustices. Following the toppling of Colston's statue in Bristol, people have begun to question, oh, he was a slave trader and a philanthropist. So what does this tell us about the history of philanthropy and how and why it functions in the way that it does? Or in short, how has the 60 billion ended up where it is, and why are the people who oversee it 99% white? It's time for the sector to consider the origins of its wealth. Lloyds of London and Greene King have recently acknowledged their ties to the slave trade and made a commitment to make amends. Why was it not the foundation sector that was leading this? ACF again had said in their strategy and governance report that foundations should be considering the origins of their wealth and whether there is a need for healing or reparation. And ACF must heed the urgency and role model anti-racist work. This isn't business as usual, and as an infrastructure organisation, it itself has a responsibility to hold the sector to account. As Ijeoma Oluo said, the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it is the only way forward. At Charity So White, we're guided by 3 principles when it comes to anti-racist work, and we encourage others to use them too. We talk about having honesty in our choices to date and in what is preventing us from achieving change, framed in a public discussion that allows for real accountability. We talk about having humility in our understanding and acknowledgement that none of us know for certain the perfect approach, but that will not prevent us from seeking answers and working together with others to create a better world. And we talk about having hope in our ability to move the needle and make a difference. I know I'm coming to time, so I just want to close. I started by sharing some experiences that we've heard, and I want to close by sharing one of my own. I have worked in fundraising myself in small charities. I have sat at my desk filling out expense lines on a spreadsheet, telling funders how much someone spent on a packet of lollipops for kids on an activity day. If you have the power to ask for these things, you have the power to do a lot more, to change your payout rates, to scrutinise the leadership and governance of the organisations you're considering funding, asking them whether they're reflective of the communities that they say they serve, examining their commitment to anti-racist work. You have the power to look inward and challenge yourselves, become more transparent and accountable in how you make decisions, and acting on what communities tell you. You have the power to work together to develop endowments and work better to get funds to Black and brown communities. Not doing so is an active choice.
Thank you, Fatima. Another really, really compelling understanding and a provocation for all of us. I'm really conscious that we've only got about 20 minutes for questions, which is not nearly enough. So I think we'll get straight into the questions because I know that there must be so many. Max, are you going to let me know, are you going to field the questions for me?
Yes, thank you, Fozia. Thank you to the speakers. We're going to go straight into questions, and a number of you have posed those in the Q&A box. Please continue to do so. I'm going to bring people in to speak and pose their question in the way they'd like to. So the first question is from Danielle Walker-Palmer from Friends Provident Foundation.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, hi. Thank you very much for the presentations. It was really powerful stuff and really helpful, I think, stimulating thinking. I suppose my question comes from a position, obviously, in a non-specialist funder in terms of Black-led organizations or race equality. Specifically, we work on the economy and the structural aspects of the economy. So my question is really, I am a Black chief exec, my chair is a brown man, and we have a good proportion of our board is from a minority ethnic community. However, we are not a specialist funder, and it was really about how we can respond effectively to the structural issues that you've highlighted. We've taken some steps, but I'm conscious of urgency, and the stuff we work on is not, we're not really structured, and we don't know enough about things to be effective in responding to urgent requirements. So the question is how we can be effective and not performative, meaning doing something to be seen to be doing something. So that's kind of the nub of my question.
Thank you, Danielle. I think I'm going to pass that to Derek because he has worked with major national foundations who aren't specifically working in this area.
I think there's two things that really strike me that has to happen here. One is that, you know, everyone is operating under these long-term traditional structures. And for that level of reconciliation and healing to occur, that takes time. But that cannot occur at the expense of money going into our community. So two things need to go, for me, hand in hand. One is that process of reconciliation within foundations for them to work things out and enabling that to take the time that's necessary to do that very, very well instead of having knee-jerk reaction to it. And then what runs alongside of that is investment, is making a conscious decision to either go into a partnership with, be it a resourcing racial justice, or to pull together funds with other foundations or use some of your endowments to ensure that the money is going into the community, so that is happening at the same time that you are going through reconciliation. The other alternative is to set up a Black and Brown led commission around this, with the foundations putting their weight behind something that has a level of autonomy and something that has a level of power that can speak equally and eye to eye with a lot of the foundations. But fundamentally for me, it's the bit that says reconciliation takes time. Go through that process and take the time to do it. In the meantime, either ring fence some of your funds or give some of your funds to organizations that can deliver the work at the same time, and then try to do some level of exchange during the process so you learn from each other.
Thank you, Derek. Max, can we have the next question?
Yes, thank you. It's from Kirsten Brown. Just going to find her on the list. Okay, Kirsten.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. I was just thinking about trustee boards, and as we know, and as ACF highlighted, 99% of foundation trustees are white. Do you think, given the very, very slow pace of change, that mandatory targets should be implemented, say by the Charity Commission? What are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, I was just on mute. Fatima, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, we've talked a lot about the need to have transparency and accountability in kind of decision making, and clearly the rate of progress on diversifying at this level has been far too slow. Whether this or another mechanism of accountability, something is needed to push foundations and on their progress.
Thank you. And it's interesting how scrutiny can sometimes be a motivating catalyst for people to change. There was a similar experience in the US when a bill was proposed which would require foundations to disclose their funding distribution and their demographics by demographics, and that bill was actually defeated in the Assembly. But the spotlight that it shot on foundations and the scrutiny that foundations then came under was actually one of the key motivating factors for them to start undertaking some real shifting work on representation. Max, next question.
Thank you. It's from Dinah Cox.
Thank you, Max. Yes, my name's Dinah Cox. I chair the Wembley National Stadium Trust, but I've also recently become the chair of Devon Community Foundation. First of all, I wanted to say thank you so much for absolutely brilliant presentations. As you said, the evidence is there. I used to be Chief Executive Officer of Race on the Agenda, and we were talking about this 20 years ago. And you can probably hear in my voice the pain. As a Black woman, I am really angry, I am really disappointed, I am really hurting and fed up with the whole thing. But besides that, thank you for letting me say that, I want to talk about the challenge I face living in a rural area. I'm a Londoner, so working in London was very different to working in an area that has a 98% white population. I was interested to know if the panel had any ideas about how I can best raise this important issue and get my staff team, my board, everybody on board when I am the only Black person in the room and one of the few Black people in the county. Thank you.
Is there anyone who wants to take that before I can just jump in quickly in terms of what I've seen? When I came into my foundation, again a community foundation, it was predominantly white-led. We didn't have any discussions in relation to race or ethnicity or funding distribution, representation on panels, etc. What I have found works is the process of education, even if it needs to be done in a very, very short time span, because we live in very urgent, critical times, and we don't have years and years to talk to people and to make them understand. I know constantly that a burden is placed on people of colour to educate white people about these issues, and my plea would be to people on this call that actually take the initiative and go and find the resources. There are reading lists, there are podcasts, everything is out there already. But sometimes as leaders, we have to push those conversations or facilitate those conversations, which I have done with my team and with my board. We're starting to have those conversations. That's all I can suggest. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in terms. Derek, sorry.
I was just one thing to add, is just self-care. Just make sure that you've got, the people, connections, community that surround you as you go on that journey, just to look after yourself as you're going through it, because it can be very painful. You might not have the peer groups that are there immediately around you to support you. So just find that community to do the self-care.
And that's a really critical point for any other people of colour on this call, because there is quite often a burden and responsibility placed on people of colour who work in foundations. When I started talking about all of these issues, particularly diversity, equity and inclusion, somebody from the States who's been doing this work for a very long time, Rinku Sen, said to me, before you undertake any of this work, build your circle of support. You're not able to do this work. You will be burnt out, you will be drained, you will be exhausted by constantly having to relive your pain and your trauma, and the pain and trauma of your community. So building your circle of support is essential to this. Otherwise, it's just such a hard undertaking. Max, should we have another question?
Yes, it's from James Tulloch.
Hi, thank you so much to everyone for really enlightening and powerful presentations. I just had a quick question. I'm Evaluation and Learning Manager at the Henry Smith Charity. I'm relatively new in post. I'm interested in the audit tool, and I just wondered whether there are any learnings from the actual implementation of the audit tool, how best we might set ourselves up to do it as quickly and as effectively as possible.
Debbie, did you want to take that?
Yes, thank you, James. I think collectively it's early days. We're expecting the Community Foundation's information to be published. We're still collating the other information, but I think that the critical thing about the tool is it's a tool and it's not a solution. All it will do is hold a mirror up to a foundation to say what you're doing. And the critical thing is, how does that feed into your strategy? This is particularly about kind of where funding is going, but there are obviously other tools about your governance, about your staffing, about other things. But the absolute critical thing is, don't think the work is done when you've done the audit. The work is starting. But to reassure you all, if you're thinking about doing the audit, it is not a particularly onerous thing to do. It's very important. It's really important to do it properly and sincerely and transparently. The aim isn't to get a good result. The aim is to get the right result, recognising there's not enough money going into the sector at the moment, so your results will be kind of poor. But maybe I shouldn't put a comment around that. The results will show a very, very low level of funding. Use that as stimulus for change.
Thank you, Debbie. And I think just talking about the fact that our foundation, we carried out this exercise, so we used the tool, and as Debbie said, it was very straightforward. Debbie and her team offer a lot of help in terms of guiding you through the process, and it gave us a snapshot of our funding distribution, but it raised a lot more questions. So again, as Debbie says, it's just the starting point of then going on to do further analysis, talk to people, discuss it with your board, implement what does this mean in terms of changing our strategy, in terms of our grant making. So it's the start of a long process, but it is a relatively simple exercise to do, so I would urge people to do it. Max, one more question, I think.
Great, thank you. I've promised 2, if that's okay, Fozia.
Okay, that's fine.
Paula Gawley is next.
Sorry, this is Michael. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, this is Michael Hughes. I'm using Paula's computer, and I couldn't find the tool to change my name. I'm from the Community Foundation in Northern Ireland, and it's just a question for Derek. Derek, you give quite a lot of organisations that we could support or should support. Are there any in Northern Ireland that spring to mind? This is in many ways new to Northern Ireland, and we have been focused very much on the Catholic Protestant inequalities and trying to overcome them, which has been done by quite a lot of legislation, and we don't want to get down that road. So if there are organisations in Northern Ireland that we could link into and make alliances with, that would be really useful, because we are starting on this journey, and particularly with some support from Comic Relief.
Unfortunately, I don't know of any of key organisations in Northern Ireland, but I'm sure there's plenty of people that are probably on this call that will know some. And also, while I know that some of the organisations I mentioned will have chapters and will have, a UK-wide reach in terms of the work that they do, I wouldn't necessarily put myself forward as being the expert of knowing they might be black or brown led. Are they good or exceptional organisations? I wouldn't know that level of that much, but I'm sure there are people on this call that would know better than I would.
Thank you, Derek. And I think because of time restrictions, we do have to just go to our final question now, Max.
Yeah, it's from Ali Nur.
Hi everyone, my name is Ali. I'm an evaluation learning manager at Comic Relief. Just have a question about diversity. Just in and of itself, perhaps not being enough. It's not enough to have bodies in the room in leadership, but how can we ensure that they're sort of either not co-opted or then, let's say, given the space to make the changes necessary and lead that change? How can we hold them to account? Or what could be done to make sure that that's effective?
Thank you, Ali. Delani, do you want to answer this? Because I know Comic Relief have done some work on this, which would be useful for everyone to know about.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we're still at an early stage, so I'll welcome other inputs as well. So I think there's a couple of things. Speaking from my own experience as well, I think when you're working with sort of black and brown communities within your institution, sometimes you need to take bigger steps in reinforcing the role that they play within the organisation, in order that they personally feel that they're being given the space and leadership to drive this agenda, but B, also signalling the importance of it to others within your institution. So whether that means title, pay, placement within the leadership structure, those are like some very practical things that I think institutions need to be thinking about. I think some of the other areas as well is around, kind of to Derek's point, around support. How do you actually support those people in the background to have the networks that they need in order to do this work without feeling that it's extremely damaging to them to be leading these conversations within primarily white or undiverse institutions? So I think that's a sort of second thing to be thinking about. And then I think the third is sort of, it's avoiding tokenism. It's not making it the individual burden of that one person to solve a societal and structural challenge. It's about then beginning to embed that into CEO, chair, leadership team, goals and objectives, and putting real deliverables and resources behind that. I think when you start to see those things happening, then I think you start to see that the organisation is on the journey and at the starting point properly. And then it's about sort of how that evolves. So that would be sort of my contribution to that.
Derek?
Yeah, and I would just add to that that's why I think it's so important to have an independent commission or something that's independent of foundations, because we've seen from the government and who they will hire as Black and brown people to front things around Black and brown communities would not be reflective of what most Black and brown people would want. So it's not just a matter of visible representation here and just having someone on the board because they are Black or because they are brown. It's actually about getting the right people with the right track record into those positions, and not just having one token person. So that's where I talk about this takes time, and it takes thought, and it takes some level of independence, autonomy, or something separate to work alongside foundations. Because as I said, if you look at what's happened with recent reports that have come out from the government, there's been a huge level of dissatisfaction from the Black and brown communities around a lot of that stuff. And you don't want to replicate that way of doing things, i.e. Black and brown token figures, just to appease community.
Thank you, Derek. That's a really important point. And I'm afraid that we don't have any more time for questions. And I know it's incredibly disappointing, because it's almost as if we got a glimpse or a snapshot into a really, really deep and interesting discussion, which we just don't have the time to take any further at this point. But I am confident that Carol and the team will be taking forward. And just to conclude, when Max asked me about this webinar, and when we were discussing what it should be in the format, he actually asked me what I would like to see as an outcome in terms of, because you know, foundations, we love our outcomes. And I thought about it, and I thought about the 3 things that I would like people to leave with following this conversation. And there are 3 things that I really want to see. The first is that I want this conversation to be the one which ignites a change in the sector, where philanthropy owns and implements the recommendations made by all these experts on the panel. They've given the solutions, it's about implementation now. Secondly, I want this to be the moment where we examine our history critically and the patterns of harm that can be replicated in our sector. And thirdly, I want this to be the moment where we hold each other to account, working collectively to advocate for much needed changes in inequitable policies and practices. And in order to do this, we have to commit to anti-racist work. We have to work with communities. We have to change our definition of risk. We have to change our perception of expertise. And we have to work to mitigate the power and privilege that we hold. And I end with this. Philanthropy must shift from the position of gatekeeper to the role of ally and partner. Failure to do this may perpetuate the very inequities that we seek to solve. And on that note, I will hand over to Carol to wrap up, but I just want to say thank you again to my wonderful panelists, and I really hope that this is just the start of the conversation.
Thank you. On behalf of everyone on this call, I would just like to say an enormous thanks to all of our panelists for such a powerful, thought-provoking and practical conversation. You've given the foundation community a lot of recipes there to take practical action, so thank you. And I would especially like to thank Fawzia Ervan for chairing that discussion so beautifully and for setting out a manifesto for action. So thank you, Fawzia. There's much here for ACF to reflect on and to consider how we better support you in this work. So thank you all. We've delivered our promise of finishing on time. I hope that you've found something useful from this webinar, and we look forward to continuing this discussion, this debate, this call to action. Thanks.